And we're live. Hello. Welcome. I'm so excited to be here. It's been another week, a long week, but a happy week. I got some great news, and I cannot wait to start getting very much into it. I am so freaking hyped to be here. This is honestly one of my favorite parts of the week is just being here, talking to you guys, talking to everyone. Hope everyone's been having a very good day at least, But I'm excited. So I want to start kicking things off with a bit of good news and do a small State of the Union address. So, what is the State of the Union address? Well, it's quite simple. We had one a few weeks ago in America, but in this case, we're going to be talking about the United Paizo workers, and specifically this tweet right here. So, if you are listening to this, if you're watching in retrospect, the tweet is saying the Paizo workers at Paizo have reached a tentative agreement on grievance and arbitration procedures. Bargaining continues to go well. This is amazing for the Paizo workers. I am so excited to see where you guys go. Obviously, you have Deadly D8's full support, and overall, I'm so very proud. So keep up the amazing work. I'm so glad that Paizo's getting this union in general. Yeah. On to more news. So, you might have noticed that we have a sponsor for today's stream. I present to you World Anvil. I want to take a moment and thank our friends over at World Anvil. If you haven't heard of World Anvil, then strap in. World Anvil is an online interactive tool that helps GMs like myself who go crazy with lore to centralize all of the work into one place. In fact, I love using World Anvil to keep track of my timeline throughout the games. I specifically put in an entry for every single session, mark what happened in that session, which makes note-taking so much easier. It's an amazing resource where you can track maps, NPCs, kingdoms, locations, and so much more. Even before today's stream, I was using World Anvil fairly consistently for all of my games. And I'm including from homebrew games to my Age of Ashes games to Iron Gods when I was running it for Tui and Ruby Phoenix and so on and so forth. I really hope you check it out. It's got so much to offer and can really centralize and localize all your notes into one very easy to manage resource. All right. Thanks, Hijinks. So, we're talking about building worlds. World building, one of my favorite parts about Pathfinder 2nd Edition or any TTRPG, whether it is Kids on Bikes, D&D 5e, regardless of the system, I think world building has always been one of my favorites, is because it's one of the times as a GM you have complete control and your players cannot mess it up, depending on the game. But it's specifically Pathfinder and most TTRPGs, you are going to have as much creative control as you possibly want through the lens of world building. So, what does this all mean? If you're a new GM, one, I commend you for being here, as I am super nerdy, and you will see very soon. But if you're a new GM and you're trying to get into Pathfinder 2e or D&D 5e or whatever world, a lot of questions that I see come up is, where do I start? I have so many ideas. I have these gods. I have these kingdoms. I know exactly where I want the players to go from levels 1 through 20, and I know that they're gonna, start in Ustalav, make their way over to Numeria, then hit the River Kingdoms, then go up to the land of the Linorm Kings, and then somehow make their way down to the Mana Wastes, and it works in the sense that if you are thinking broadly about where you want your campaign to generally go, then yes, this having big ideas like that works, especially in the beginning where you're just going, oh, I got this crazy idea. We're going to be killing Tarrasques by the time they're level 20. And, they're going to slay ancient red dragons. I commend you for being so happy and enthusiastic. In fact, I quite often let ambition take over when I'm doing any type of world building. And I think where I like to start is on the players. Now, I've seen this advice give out to a lot of GMs. This is what helped me in particular, as I have a ton of just boiled up creative energy that anytime I'm given a chance to build a new world, I will immediately rush to the page and will start thinking about 20 million things. But I think the most helpful advice is first focus on the theme. The theme of the story is what's going to be most important. You want to be able to tell, when giving a synopsis of your setting, of your campaign to your players, you want to go, okay, I want a school of magic users, and we're going to all study magic, and then take that magic and use it practically in the real world as we study the Magambia Expanse. Magambia Academy. God, there's so many M's over there. So having that central theme to wrap everything in is what's going to help you get started in your broader quest of creating the setting, creating the world for your players. Now, APs have a lot of lore pre-built into them. This could either be a good or bad thing depending on what kind of GM style you want to go for. If you want very lore heavy, then you can see behind me, like, there's the Lost Omens lines. Like, if you're setting a Galarian, there is tons of rich lore built into the setting. So if we're talking purely the Milwaukee Expanse, and I don't know too much about Strength of 1,000, so somebody in chat, feel free to yell at me. But the Strength of 1,000 AP is set primarily in the Milwaukee Expanse. We have a whole Lost Omens book just dedicated to how the Milwaukee Expanse works, its history, where it's going in the future. And I think taking that principle, you don't have to write a 400-page book, but perhaps maybe keeping your theme centralized to one specific place. If you're running superheroes, like let's say you're running a Masks, a New Generation game, well, that game primarily focuses on teen development or growing in character. And I think what I want to do, let's say I want to tell a very dark, very much like The Boys or Invincible, where it's this very dark and grim setting. Well, then I kind of want my central theme to be, this is a very realistic take on superheroes. What happens if you're giving superheroes like Batman and Superman a more realistic grounds to go off of? So, even with a simple sentence like, I want to explore the frozen lands of the Linorm Kings, you are automatically setting up yourself for so much more world building than you possibly can imagine. Let's say that you're doing a traditional fantasy, very Lord of the Rings, and so you want your theme if you're gonna like mirror kind of Middle Earth Tolkien vibes, let's say you want your theme to be knights in shining armor going out and slaying dragons. Maybe Lord of the Rings was a bad example. Maybe a little bit more like Dragonlance. But let's say this is your theme. You're going to go out. You're going to steal gold from dragons. You're going to slay any evil creature that dares threaten the kingdom. Well, we got some very good technology stuff right there. We're covering culture, technology, and where you're taking your campaign. In terms of technology, we know that we're going in a medieval route, very much a 13th, 15th century Eastern European vibe. Um, in terms of technology, we're definitely looking in terms of you're only using swords. Maybe there's gonna be a few firearms, crossbows, and the likes. And so we've already established two very key things right there, because we also have culture going for us, as we are going to be telling, tales of aristocrats and nobles and knights and, maybe seedy rogues, or, that one NPC that looks particularly dashing, that has always a evil, cunning plan. And then, you name him Worm Tongue or something worm, and he ends up being the traitor. There's no need to be subtle. So, let's say we take this overall idea of I'm going to go out and slay dragons. Well, how do you build upon that? Do you have just the idea of I want my players to face ancient dragons, and slay them in their hordes, and steal all their gold? Well, start with the local region. Where do you want your players to start? Do you want them to start in a town? Perhaps it's a small upcoming kingdom. I don't suggest you actually start with the entire world. Don't start with the continent. Start with where you want your players to start. Where do you want your players to go? Having it where it's where your players are starting is going to centralize a lot. Who are the key NPCs they're going to be talking to throughout your adventure? Is it going to be the holy cleric, or who's giving them divine messages to go out and, maybe give them some holy relics? Perhaps it's the king and queen themselves calling upon the adventurers to help them in whatever quest. Or perhaps you decide to go the traditional route. Maybe meeting up in a tavern isn't such a bad thing after all. I think when you start putting your setting in terms of the players, you're going to start seeing a lot more of the overall richness come out. Because yes, you can have the idea for a 50 god pantheon, and maybe the kingdom is heavily exports a lot of iron ore, and that's how they make primarily their profit. And you are going to study the trade routes. Maybe it's a little bit more like Settlers of Catan. You study the trade market. Well, if your players don't really care about the international trade of your one villa and your tiny little country, then you just wrote all that lore for yourself. I mean, it's helpful for you if you find this, but if your players are finding maybe filling out tax forms is kind of boring, as it quite is in real life, then maybe start thinking about what in the context of your players. This is why session zeros is something you often want to stress when writing a world. Now, granted, if you're writing a world in terms of a third-party publisher, or somebody who's already pre-written a setting, that's a different conversation. We can get down to some mind, but right now we're going to just focus primarily on building your own setting in your own home, where you're not. If you want to live stream it, be my guest. But in terms of having all of just having your players in one place is where we're going to be primarily focusing on this conversation. You're going to, with your session 0, going to be talking with your players. Ask them what they want to see. And I know in my last campaign that I just finished up not too long ago, I asked my players at the beginning of the adventure, what do you want to see? Do you want to see adventure? Do you want to see political intrigue? Maybe you want horror, Maybe we want to do a deep study on liches, and maybe you all are going out and trying to slay Vecna the Ascended. Go from that, or you could take even an environment that you're already familiar with. Let's say Avatar: The Last Airbender. I don't know how you're going to do this in Pathfinder 2e, but best of luck to you. But you have a very good space in between Avatar Aang and Avatar Korra. Maybe you talk about the rising technology in between the two series. Perhaps you set your adventure right after the fall of Sauron. talk with your players about where they want to go, because at the end of the day, you all succeed when you all are telling the same story that you want to tell. This doesn't mean that you can't, immediately pull out knives and start sticking them in the back of players as soon as session 1 begins. After all, I've done that. I've literally dropped players right onto a plot twist well within their first session, because that was what they wanted. They wanted a political intrigue game. So I gave them a political intrigue game. I am so happy to see some of you guys in the chat. I'm recognizing so many names. Hi, everyone. We are gonna talk about world building. If you haven't seen any of the stream already, I can speak. I'm totally not absolutely tired right now. So, let's say we just, we are going to stick with this knight in shining armor killing dragons theme. Well, the great place to start is to work on the kingdom where they start. If your players want horror and, they're going to go out and go slay dragons, well, what about zombie dragons? Put a twist on it. Maybe horror you can start seeing coming from the undead. How do dragons affect the land around them? Perhaps it twists monsters, Perhaps a red dragon will twist a troll's anatomy, so they're no longer weak to fire, but perhaps maybe cold. Having just a bullet point list of this is where I want to start to where I want to go is what's going to help you out so much. Because if you're like me, and if you have I'm particularly neurodivergent, I have ADHD with a bunch of other stuff, I'm sure you can already tell. Having bullet points for me is what helps my butt so often. Because I can tell you, like, opening up a very thick book of a setting where it's just like, oh my god, there's so much lore, I'm not going to be able to remember this. Just bullet point it out. Maybe your kingdom is called Ironsville. It exports iron, and the king and queen sit on iron thrones. Totally not Game of Thrones. And then you start going from there. Just go, okay, so the king and queen hire the party, and they are going to explore this much of the region. All you have to do is just bullet point out what's in between those parts. Maybe on their way to the dragon, they run into a small little local town. You only need 4 or 5 bullet points. Go, here's a main tavern where the PCs can stay. Maybe here's 2 or 3 key NPCs. And maybe there's a potential plot hook, a side quest going on there. Having your players just go the small distance of just talking with a few NPCs can lead to a bunch of funny interacting moments, because you can just have your NPCs be as wild and crazy as you want. You could just have a little gnome farmer who just really likes doing his work here, and he's a gardener, and he's worked at the local tavern to make ends meet. But he's been recently having a bullet problem, and you need to send out Osiris and Obscura to go take care of it. You could take stuff like this, and then that's how you populate the world. Is you just take small bullet points of bullet pun intended here. Taking small bullet points, and that's how you further enhance your world. And if you have time, and if you really have time, and you have more to write more. Just make sure you have your players in mind, If you're running a Starfinder game, you don't need to write about what's on Vesk 5 unless it actually affects what's happening on Absalon Station. I think when you start picturing your setting, not in terms of where it's the Lost Omens, where it's a published line, you're gonna need money. Oh, I know. I'm gonna keep saying how I want it to, Eldritch. You're going to make sure that everything connects, because if you're just writing for yourself, then yeah, go ahead. That's honestly what authors are for. They like writing things down, apparently. I don't know why. But the overall connectiveness your world needs doesn't always have to be, it's Game of Thrones where I have to connect this NPC to this NPC, and then you just go, oh, and then the cousin of this, and then the second Duke Ham of, Withersford here, and then, oh, but this one married into the family, but then was slain, and then that's why the inheritance of this other family that came out of honestly nowhere is going to, have this one tiny little NPC dialogue in parentheses here, and then if this is what your players want, if they want that we're all nobles game, then yes, do that. Absolutely do that. But always make sure that you have your players in mind as you tell the story, because that's what it's going to come down to. Pathfinder 2e, D&D 5th edition, whatever TTRPG you're playing, it always will come down to what story do the players want. I just got out of a Locust game, and us as players wanted a horror-driven suspense built on trauma, and our GM Hoop on the Lost Caravan really took this in stride, and I'm very aware of their overall world building, which is have the players populate it. And I honestly love taking this to heart. Your players are going to populate the world far more because they're the ones who are making the decisions to go here. If they want to go to random shopkeeper A, well, and you didn't write that down, maybe just make... if you're not good at improv, maybe having 2 or 3 NPCs on the side that are very skeletoned and you can quickly fill in the details as you go is helpful. If you're like me, who loves to improv NPCs on the side and, and instantly whip up a frenzy of a, maybe a older female NPC named Beatrice who likes to make hats, and, but she has this one hat that she's really trying to sell that has a mysterious hole in the center of it, roughly about the size of an arrow. Then that's how you're going to start populating your world. You don't need to have every NPC written down. Eventually, you're going to just have a list, and your players might not get to all of them. And, maybe hiding dialogue trees in certain NPCs is kind of detrimental to the overall story you're trying to tell. Sounds like somebody's home. Pick a shopkeeper from Grand Bazaar. You could do that too. Let's say we're focusing on the Lost Omens line and we're focusing on Absalom. Well, Absalom has 2 very thick books titled up next to it. You have Lost Omens Absalom, City of Lost Omens book, which is a bit of a mouthful, but always fun to say. And if you are wanting to focus on the Grand Bazaar, well, you have Lost Omens Grand Bazaar. All of these are written by amazing freelancers, some of which I've had the chance to talk with here on Deadly D8, and some are down the pipeline in terms of who I need to contact. And you're going to, you can read on certain parts of the world, You don't have to essentially populate the world on your own NPCs. I mean, you can, obviously. I play in Menacing of the Atari, the beginner's box, and I'm sure my GM could probably whip up an NPC and I would never know. Always just make sure that you are kind of focusing in on the story. I think this is what it comes down to. There's a story and theme. Sorry, my dog is absolutely looking adorable on this bed, on my bed. I don't know if you can see her. She is just rolling around, and I'm sorry if that distracts me. So, now that we have our theme, let's start talking about what to expect and see. So, when I approach Pathfinder 2nd Edition settings in their games, the theme obviously comes first, but one thing I really like doing is populating it with interesting people. If you want your setting to be mostly humans, well, give me an explanation why. What has stopped, local elves, dwarves, Kunrasu, Golema, so on and so forth from inhibiting this town. Perhaps it was a local dragonborn commune that had recently been invaded, and this was more of a small shelter than it is anything else. Sometimes grabbing an old PC or PC concept your group never saw works too. That's true. If your setting had recently had adventurers, let's say you've run this particular setting before, these are, let's say they make it all the way up to level 20, they defeat Vecna or Tiamat, or they destroy the World Wound, or defeated Unity in the battle under Silvermount, so on and so forth. Well, you just you could bring back those PCs. In fact, even if your PCs had, like, your current players used to play those PCs, seeing those guys come back will absolutely make them lose their minds. I've done this before, where I've had PCs from other campaigns just appear, because that's how they exist in the timeline. At the current point where that story is being told, they are the most important people in the region. They're celebrities at that point. You are level 20. You are practically gods on Earth. Of course, somebody's gonna know you. And walking around, you might see where that goes. I'm just reading the chat, just making sure I didn't miss anything. So, let's talk. So, continuing on with my point of populating a world full of interesting people, I really stress having diversity in your setting is what's really going to make your setting pop. Telling different stories from different perspectives, having just NPCs of different genders, ancestries, classes, backgrounds, even really help to tell your story. In fact, even just having a female wizard is enough of an interesting story, where you can just title about maybe this female wizard in particular was studying staves, and they became the #1 in the world of when it came to staff making, and perhaps she's sought after by the greatest of wizards trying to get staves forged for them. You can just continue on with this, like, idea of just creating and populating, because you're filling it up with more and more diverse names, more diverse people, and overall you're going to get a far more richer story. You can easily archetype, knight in shining armor A, B, C, D, E, F, and they all speak with a proper British accent. Oh god. Turn to Sean Connery for a second. And, they all have the same handlebar mustache, and you can easily do that. Or perhaps maybe the guard captain is a undead. Maybe a vampire that recently woke from their tomb just to serve back in the Knights of Lastwall to slay whatever the impending forces of the undead. Which is actually a really fun time to bring up that Book of the Dead drops in a few weeks, and I am absolutely hyped for it, because as well as Knights of Lastwall. If you want also NPCs, you're not limited to just the Lost Omens. If you're building a homebrew setting and you want a certain NPC from other settings to come in, then yeah, feel free. It is your game. Like, honestly, if you want Darth Vader to appear in your Numeria game, there's nothing much to stop you from doing it. You can just pluck it, give him a new name, call him, I don't know, Darth Helmet, then boom, you automatically Dampier. Oh, I will never pronounce things right. I'm a rebel. And you can just straight up rip Darth Vader out, call him Darth Helmet, and perhaps instead of wielding a lightsaber, he's wielding a light sword that's on fire, that's conveniently red, can use psionic powers, and can wreck a party. Very much in the theme of Darth Vader. But you can easily do this with any NPC. Perhaps it's the Black Knight from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And, you know, you just have a knight whose arm was cut off in battle, and he refuses to acknowledge it. And anytime the PC asks about it, he's just like, "It is but a flesh wound." And that just happens over and over and over again. Where it is just you could just bring characters. So if you're not particularly creative or can't, you know, come up with NPCs quickly on the fly, perhaps with maybe GMs such as Brennan Lee Mulligan, Matt Mercer, basically any GM that kind of runs their whole shtick on improv, then yes, you can easily just go, here's Avatar Aang, and now he's in Starfinder. Your PCs, unless you're really on the nose about it, will ever check unless you were like, here is quite literally Avatar Aang. I keep referencing Avatar Starfinder. That's probably because I've been watching it again recently. You know, it is very fun. But let's say you take an archetype of the character. Let's say it's John Wick, perhaps. A man who's angry on his path of vengeance. That describes a lot. Just take that archetype and apply it to the NPC that you're wanting to interact with. Maybe it's a shopkeeper, perhaps, and, you know, their dog recently died, and they wanted to get vengeance, but they ran out of money, and they couldn't, so they had to open a shop to make some quick cash, and that's why everything has to be, you know, marked up as much as it can, and he's willing to make any kind of bartering deal, because that's one step closer to vengeance. And yeah, he's thinking he's back by the time he gets all of his gold. And you could just roleplay that out. It's honestly the greatest part about playing systems like Pathfinder, or, to be honest, any TTRPG where you're allowed to just flex that big old creativity, brain, muscle, and juice. Because that's what people really enjoy. Your players are going to really enjoy, you know, not a 32-page backstory on an NPC, but perhaps maybe 4 or 5 key details. All right. Yeah, definitely John Wicker. I love that. All right. So we have our theme. We have the diversity of the population. Guys, chat, you gotta stop making me laugh while I'm trying to make a point. Let's talk about religion. So, religion and magic in these two cases are going to work very closely together. After all, how religious is your particular kingdom going to be? Are you perhaps ruled by priests of Desna, and your whole kingdom is about telling dreams, you know, looking at the stars, you know, maybe every now and then they have a holiday just dedicated to sleeping, and every shop in town is closed except for a blanket shop, which will give you a free blanket and a pillow for you to rest your head upon. Perhaps there is no gods in your world, and your clerics have recently lost connection to all of their divine magic. They have to go out and go find their missing deities. Very much a bright post-after calamity from Dragonlance. I feel like this entire stream is just going to be references to other materials instead of like anything I've actually written myself. So we'll see how this goes. But when it comes to religion, you can tell so many different interesting types of religions and how it affects the world. Perhaps maybe religion was ditched long ago when the humans of the world decided to turn their backs on them, and now only orcs can contact their deity because through sheer belief and their abilities alone, they have managed to access the divine pool. After all, anything they make can and will work until they stop believing in it. With just a few simple sentences like this, you are already telling way more of a story than, honestly, your players will even probably think of. You're going to be telling so much with just the gods left for the world. And if your players go, why did they leave the world? Well, congrats, there's another 2 or 3 bullet points. But never really go farther than 2 or 3 questions. That's why I like to think about it, is The first question, the first bullet point should be statement, followed by the question, why? Why did this happen? Well, because the humans decided to turn. They, because they decided to turn, the gods thought they weren't needed anymore, and they decided to leave. Search the stars to find other planets or beings that are willing to worship them the same way that the humans once did. And if you go from there, you keep just building on this idea of why and why. Now, granted, if you find yourself hitting page 10 on the why section and it really doesn't relate to the players anymore, then maybe perhaps you've gone too far to take a few steps back, take a few deep breaths, maybe an hour off of your work, and just come back with a fresh mindset of, okay, I let my ambition get the best of me, as we all do, and now you are going to start telling the story once more. And you're going to start seeing the effects of the players start to inhabit it. After all, if your players completely ignore an entire region, well, you kind of just wrote that region for yourself. They're not going to really care about what's happening, you know, over in the Isles of Terror if you're kind of running your adventure in Katapesh. Also, mystifying religion Pathfinder is very clear with the origins of divine gods. Yeah, so earlier today I was I don't think I could talk too much about this, but I heard this very interesting concept for how the specific deity pantheon worked in this particular setting, and having this very different approach on religion in general tells a very rich story. Perhaps your gods are merely figments of imagination, and instead of worshipping actual gods, the players are worshipping the old ones. Perhaps they're a little bit more Cthulhu worshipping, or perhaps maybe the gods are walking amongst the mortals, but when the players worship them, maybe they're getting intercepted by the Titans, and the Titans grow in power the more you pray to them, and maybe your players have to stop the religion and the praying to the Titans to cease, and that's the plot. And you quite literally just build and build and build and build and build on top of it, and eventually, by the time you're reaching 4 or 5 levels in, you have a pretty good thick document of lore just sitting and ready to go. And this is what always brings me back to building worlds, telling stories, is having this overall broader approach to the setting of being, I will write what the PCs ask me to write. And I know I keep saying this over and over and over again, but I seriously cannot stress, it will always come back down to the PC. Because after all, your PCs can have more control than you do sometimes. You have the power when writing the initial setting. You have the power when telling more of the lore. But if your players simply do not care, then write that book for yourself. Because at that point, it is a book and no longer a role-playing experience. So, we have covered cultures. We have covered diversifying your world, where to get started, and let's start talking about magic. How high or low fantasy are you willing to go? So, to define some terms, define some terms here. High fantasy, high magic settings are very much your Harry Potters, where magic is everywhere. Perhaps it's more like the Magicians, where certain people have access to magic, and to learn magic, you might have to become a hedge witch. Having defined how much magic is in your world is going to tell your players how much to expect from your monsters. And, oh, hello there, Joshua. The high magic settings are going to expect to see some of your monsters also casting spells. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, pervasive magic is a subsystem you can apply onto monsters to give them more magic. And the more you decide to add magic to the setting, the more and more freaky stuff you can do with it. Perhaps your magic system doesn't work like Pathfinder normally, and it works on mana. Calling your spell slots just simply your mana pool instead of just calling it a spell slot. Perhaps everybody is a spontaneous caster, and there's no real way to prepare them anymore, as everybody has to take the flexible preparation archetype. Having high magic means you can tell wonky and crazy insane stories, and if you ever find yourself in a plot hole, just go, "'Cause magic." You have no idea how many times in a game where my players, or specifically my note taker, goes, "Wait, hold on." It's like the ultimate Kronk going, "Well, how did we get here, Kronk?" "Well, you simply got BB." Of just being like, "Well, obviously they teleported from point A to point B. Because magic. Magic can do that sometimes." And you can start telling this full on, where it's like Pathfinder the Lost Omens, where where magic is such a key important part of the overall system, where if you remove magic from the Lost Omens, it doesn't feel the same. However, there are settings within the Lost Omens that don't focus on magic quite as much as other settings will. Absalom is going to focus a lot more on magic than, let's say, Numeria post-Technic League. Sorry. And then you're going to start seeing... okay, so that's high magic. Now let's start talking about low magic. Low magic's very much your Game of Thrones, your Lord of the Rings, where magic isn't really available to everyone. It hasn't been seen for quite some time, or maybe certain people have access to magic, but they can't cast a lot of spells. Think Gandalf. Gandalf is more of a magus, where he can't cast a lot of spells in the day, but can sure wield a sword. And the low magic settings, you start to explain why there's basically no magic going on. Perhaps the magic pool right before the players started broke, and the only way to access magic is through ley lines, and ley lines are incredibly difficult to find, let alone keep a reservoir up. And you start to tell this intricate tale of, well, magic was destroyed, and that's why only certain people who are still born with the gift, perhaps, of having magic, these particular magic users are hunted because they can only do so much. Very much kind of like The Witcher. The Witcher is kind of a low fantasy. I would say it's a little bit more mid-range, as The Witcher himself can, the Witchers can cast magic, but not every human or not every elf, whatever, has access to the specific type of magic. No, they're not all Witchers. But even settings such as Star Wars, where you can go easily pull that meter back and forth between, oh, this is a lot of magic. Let's say you're focusing on the Jedi or the Sith, and if you want to turn the tone into low magic, perhaps maybe telling the story about the clone troopers, bounty hunters, so on and so forth. I will say Revenge of the Sith is a high magic setting, whereas The Mandalorian Season 1, not quite so much Season 2, is very much low magic, where the only spellcaster in the party was an NPC named Baby Yoda, or Grogu, because we didn't really get a name yet. And having this dynamic knowing where your boundary is will really help you telling a specific setting. Perhaps maybe your there is a particular village that can cast magic, and it's it's an asylum for all their magic users in the world, and that's where they can study and enhance their magic. But everywhere else, it's very low magic. Not everyone can cast spells. Or maybe you're high magic, and the troll can release a cone of cold and, bonk them with a club all at the same time. Very much a little bit more high magic. And so I don't think Gandalf's a war priest. Alright, Gandalf's a magus. He can only cast a few spells a day. He only casts like maybe 4 or 5 in the total trilogy that we see, include the Hobbit book. He has a little bit more. Yes, he comes from divine sources, but you could just... Actually, this is a really good way of explaining this real quick. Perhaps, let's say Gandalf, for instance, he gets his power from a divine source. Well, perhaps it's more like Nethys, where Nethys has access to all magic, not just limited down to the divine pool. Obviously, he draws from the divine pool. But Gandalf is a little bit more of a wizard. He studies his the lore. Perhaps he's even a lore master. But he definitely can only cast a couple spells per day, as we see him get weak after he casts spells. And yeah, I would say very much like he's an Asmar Magus. Thank you so much. Because he comes from a celestial background. He's one of the wizards of Lord of the Rings, where I believe it's really 7. After all, he is Gandalf the White and Gray. And, then you obviously have the blue twin wizards, Radagast the Brown, Saruman the White, so on and so forth. I can keep talking about Lord of the Rings if you really want me to. But having different explanations for maybe why certain... if you have a god of... You have a god of magic, and he is, in control of the divine pool. Maybe he also has access to the arcane pool. If you're talking strictly in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, as we're going to do, you're going to tell this, you could tell a really interesting story where I play in a homebrew setting where all magic comes from deities. Arcane, occult, primal, it doesn't matter. It's all drawing from deities. But however, you have deities of different traditions. My occult deities are a little bit more of Cthulhu-y. They're very much of the Ire, where vampires and more occultish based creatures, certain types of undead will worship these gods. If they're more of arcane, this is where wizards will go and pray to their deity and use tomes of religious texts to find arcane magic inside of them, and the deities bless them with arcane knowledge every day. Your primal deities could be a little bit more like what Leshies and Ents will worship, and you could just reflavor different pools of magic to tell this very interesting story. And even with just the very brief sentences I just said right there, of certain deities that have access to certain pools, and then they bless them with certain divine powers, then you are going to start telling a very rich story of seeing the world populate itself with just a few broad strokes. Because that's, if I could really stress anything, is that you just need broad strokes, and you can fill in the details as your players explore. Talking with your players in between sessions is really what's going to help in this case, as your players will go from location to location, but in between sessions go, all right, guys, I think we're really wrapping up this location. Perhaps you guys want to go in this direction, or do you guys want to go to this town? Well, great. Thank you for letting me know a few sessions ahead of time. I can start populating that town with interesting ideas, and just quite literally move your players from point A to point B, point C. And I think when we come back from the break, which is going to come up in a few minutes, we're going to start talking about how your villains will affect the world. After all, villains are my favorite part about telling stories, because you can do so many excuses with a villain. It's not even funny. So, the last thing I want to talk about right before we go to break is technology. Now, I love technology in my games. I have a few GMs who disagree with me and my absolute love of Numeria, but I essentially will call it the Numeria to Knights in Shining Armor scale. How much do you want to slide this scale back and forth of, do you want Knights, Knights be able wielding laser guns? Perhaps you push them more towards, recently firearms were invented, but they're very basic. You're not going to have your cowboy revolver quite yet. Or you could do what Lost Omens did, where you have Numeria for your laser guns, and if you go closer to Irison, you're going to start seeing World War One guns as quite literally World War One soldiers. They're pouring through because the Rasputin Must Die module from Reign of Winter. I can go into that one too, don't worry. I'm still a big nerd. And overall, sliding this meter of, I want this much technology, maybe reflecting on actual history can help you. Telling of, well, I want my setting to be told in this kind of age, where it's the late 16th century and firearms are a little bit more pervasive. Every culture is kind of experimenting with gunpowder, coming up with new ways of using firepower. And that's why I'm going to use all of the guns strictly in Guns and Gears, but I'm going to write out beast guns, as beast guns might not fit my setting. Having this ability to kind of turn on and off different, I would say, stats in quotes of, well, I turn on this story here, I turn on this ability here, and just you kind of start meshing and playing and kind of just start coalescing everything into one particular space. And that's when you start telling stories like the Lost Omens, where you have both, World War One tanks being thrown out of somewhere. I won't say a lot about it, but you can go from that to maybe the Mwangi Expanse, and specifically the Magambian Academy, where technology is kind of not as pervasive. I guess you're not going to see androids with laser guns quite as often as you would as if you were in Numeria. I think talking with your players ahead of time of just going, well, I really want my story to be focused on late 1800s cowboys, settling of the West, where you all have access to your revolvers, your flintlock guns, and oh god, I co-wrote a whole book on guns, and now I'm forgetting all of their names. But you're gonna get access to so many more of these like firearms, where your players can then build their characters out of, and then hopefully your players will listen to you and respect you enough. I don't think it's out of respect. Hopefully they like listening to you, I guess is going to be my overall thing, where you say, these are things I am not willing to negotiate on. I really want firearms to be a big part of the setting, as maybe as gunpowder and other forging tools start to become more and more prevalent. You're going to start seeing more and more technology start being implemented in the world. And so, wrapping up the first part of the stream, and before we hit the we're on a break buzzer, here's key things to just remember, take away. 1, communication with your players is always going to be number 1. Having a session -1 or a session 0 to talk about your setting, where you want your setting to kind of generally take place, is very important, because your players might give you ideas that you might not have thought about. 2, how much religion do you want? What does a pantheon particularly look like in your world? Start small with deities that your players might perhaps worship, and then branch out from there. How much magic do you want in your world? Another important question to ask yourself is, how many spells am I really willing to deal with? Am I going to have every monster be able to cast a spell? Perhaps it's a little bit more where Pathfinder is, where it's directly down a little bit more on the high magic side of the world, where not every monster can cast spells, but a lot of monsters have access to spells. And another thing to just remember in general is where do you want your technology to be set? Having clear bounds of, well, I want firearms to be very new, so not a lot of people have access to it. Think very much campaign 1 of Critical Role. And people mostly use crossbows to, I want my cowboy, and I want him to be pew, 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 clicking off them guns, and, firing a bullet that fires 2 other bullets. Because, why not? Having that framework is what's going to be really important. Just remember to respect everyone at the table, populate your world full of diverse voices, and you can never really go wrong with any of the combinations I just said. And with that, I think we're going to take a quick 5-minute-ish break. We'll come back. We're going to actually talk about how villains and players will affect the world, but most specifically villains, as villains have always been my favorite parts about telling TTRPGs. And with that, I pause Bardley. And we'll see you when we get back. Bye. And we're back. Hopefully with Bardley working. Come on, technical difficulty. No, never mind. This was on my end. Doesn't matter. We're all good. We're back. How awesome is that Sniping Duo archetype video? I don't like tooting my own horn a lot, but that video came out so great. And is a great segue into villains and why I love me some BBEGs. For those who don't know, BBEGs are big bad evil guys. Probably an outdated term in retrospect, but your villain is going to be your overarching enemy. This can range from your small mini boss to maybe your Vecna, your Emperor Palpatine, your Sauron. Christ, I am tired. So the way that you could start implementing all of this into your world is thinking about how the kind of villain you want to have. So let's say you're doing a political intrigue campaign. You're going to start seeing a kind of villain that is very heavy into politics, is going to be a little bit more, I guess, cynical in the sense of perhaps they disagree with what the king and queen has been doing recently and will want to stab them in the back. You're going to do a little bit more of a high magic setting. Maybe it's a little bit more of a doppelganger situation. And your overall arcing bad guy is someone who can shift into any NPC at a given notice. And your players have a hard time telling who's their friend and who's their enemy. Villains have an interesting approach to the world, because you have to remember, all villains have motivation. For Star Wars, Darth Vader's motivation is serving the Emperor. Saruman, serving Sauron. Voldemort is trying to kill a little teenager boy who, frankly, cannot die. All of these villains, what they have in common is motivation. They're all going to be motivated and driven by goal. But something you have to remember is you can't make your villains too sympathetic. A lot of people have is find your players siding with the villain, perhaps, and you didn't intentionally want them to do it, perhaps change how your villains approach. You don't need to go crazy. You don't need to burn down an orphanage or anything like that. But show what extremism looks like. If your villain is a druid, perhaps, maybe they're an eco-terrorist, willing to do anything to set plants and any plant life free by any means necessary, even if that means killing. Well, that's a villain right there. Quite honestly, that's somewhat poison ivy. You start telling this very interesting kind of twisted look at the players. A great way to tell a villain story is to reflect on the players. Perhaps your villain is a reflection upon the players. A twisted look at what they could have become, what they can become. The Joker is obviously a twist on Batman. What would happen if Batman decided to start killing and will mercilessly go about doing it? Twisting Batman's motivation. His no-kill rule is what makes Batman Batman. Twist your players. If you have a fighter that believes in truth, justice, and the Absalonian way, well, perhaps your villain is what happens if that player crossed a boundary. What happens if they go too far? The way that you're going to start seeing your villains thrive in the world is just sometimes having them act independently of the players. Your villains can be autonomous. They're allowed to do whatever they kind of want to do. You have access to them as they're your resource to tell the story. Perhaps your villain wanted to take over a particular kingdom, failed, and, they really want to try again. Well, perhaps your villain is slowly taking over other kingdoms. Perhaps certain key heads to the crown are starting to get killed, certain dukes and duchess. Start seeing this kind of overall narrative unfold. And this is one of the times as a GM, you have complete control. You can have your villains be somewhat a string of mini bosses, perhaps, that they have to be. Picture the four elemental benders in season 3 of Korra, where you have Zahir, who leads a gang of, well, let's say the opposite of the party. After all, the Azir is a reflection on what if Avatar Aang, I know this is the wrong series, decided to go a step too far. You start to tell this very intricate story of, and obviously this is just one way of looking at it, but a very intricate story of what the players could be. What happens if you drive them a step too far and put them in situations where they might have to cross that line. Obviously, don't force them if you don't have to, but start seeing at what point does the hero compromise their morals, become the very thing they are wishing to destroy. After all, the Reverse Flash is quite literally called the Reverse Flash. He is a twisted version of the Flash himself. Okay, so chat brought up this very interesting point of not every villain needs a 10-page backstory. Having the regular Saturday morning cartoon will do. If you're running a very much a Monsters of the Week, kids on bikes, very villain light kind of rule set, then yeah, perhaps you want to, tell a narrative where the bad guys are constantly switching in and out, and the motivation is because I'm evil and because I need to steal some gold because I like money and money, and then they just go rob the bank. That could be a villain. You could have a very low motivation. Just give them some sort of goal. I would say that's probably the most important thing when it comes to villains, is just giving them a goal. So, how do you tie in your villains to your setting? Well, with, helpful tools like World Anvil, you can do that, in fact. One of the things I like to really do is take a setting and see, how does my villain interact with the setting? If my players are starting in a tiny town, I create that town, and then I say, okay, well, this NPC that I kept track in my little NPC catalog, well, this villain is trying to destroy this town. Perhaps he's in a very tough negotiation sentence with the overall um, uh, leaders and rulers of the town. And, the villain doesn't have to have his hand, deep in it, because after all, Thanos is not in every Marvel movie, and yet he still is the #1 contender when it came to the overall Marvel storyline. You can have just villains subtly put their toes in little pools, and then, at the very end, when your players are starting to reach the later levels of the campaign, just have your villain go in for a dive and just cause a giant splash to the world. Perhaps they destroyed a particular kingdom that the players were going to because they needed a particular resource, and now they have to go somewhere else to go find it because the villain already destroyed it. With the villains, you have access to a lot of great settings. You can run, a very much a rogues gallery, where you have maybe 4, 5, 6 key villains who have their own motivations. Let's take the Sinister Six in Spider-Man. Well, you have Spider-Man, and then his villains all have very 1 to 3 goals that they're trying to do. If it's like Carnage, they just want to cause chaos. That's a very one goal minded driven person. You don't need a lot of backstory to tell I just want to cause chaos to everything, and because that's what I need, Batman. To somebody who's a little bit more complicated. Eddie Brock, when he's being Venom, is a more motivated character. You can have deeper, levels to the characters. Kingpin is another great example of, you just need 2 or 3 bullet points and you have Kingpin, essentially. The overall structure to your story can be practically whatever you want. I like breaking it down into arcs. And this first arc of the story for, let's say, tier 1 gameplay, which is levels 1 through 5, I'm going to have this one bad guy, but this one bad guy is a minion for the tier 2. Or maybe even tier 3 gameplay. And just sort of slowly connecting the yarn to each villain to have a story be told is the way you might want to go about it. After all, there are plenty of rune lords you can tell stories with. All they have to have is just be in the common place that they're in, I believe it's Varesia, at the right time. And you kind of just start weaving this story together of just whatever you feel is necessary. And I honestly, this is where I, even prior to being sponsored, where World Anvil came in really helpful, is because I would not only track what my players were doing, I was also tracking what my villains were doing at every point. Running 2 timelines of, this is what the players did in the sessions, and this is what the villains were doing while the players were doing it. After all, you don't have to see... Okay, so one of the difficult things I find in TTRPGs is you're not going to have that villain monologue. It doesn't happen. You're not going to cut back to the villains and, you're having a speech between the two like you can in movies or TV shows or even books. It just doesn't exist. But you can tell that story in your own timeline. And so one of the things I noticed from chat that I really agree with is your villains could just be one bad day away. Telling that story of, well, he was just some guy who's down on luck and he was just one bad day away from snapping, and then just something in him broke. Just got so angry and mad, and he just went into a rage, and then, he broke his bond with his best friend and killed a bunch of younglings, and then, bowed to a new master. After all, Anakin was just one day away completely snapping, and that's what makes Darth Vader so interesting of a character when you start to really break him down. After all, Revenge of the Sith is a tale of Anakin being one day away. The great... Okay, hold on. A great example of how to build a sympathetic villain, I love turning to the Killing Joke, which is a Batman storyline of the origin, because we don't really know Joker's true origins, but seeing Joker become a sympathetic villain is some of the greatest masterclasses in how to tell an interesting villain. However, I'm going to throw this asterisk on here because I feel like this needs to be said. You should feel bad for your villain. You should not fully sympathize or agree with the villain. Arthur Fleck in the Joker is not somebody you should agree with. You can feel bad for him. You can understand where he's coming from. But he actually kills people. He crosses a line. A lot of us will never cross. And there's just some rules that your heroes will keep up. They are going to have this sort of story be told for them, where you can feel bad for your villain. You can try even convincing the villain to come to your side. Perhaps maybe they're not strictly evil, but they're just... They don't know where to go, and it's the only thing they know that can get results. I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but I think Fantasy High, Season 2, does a great job of that overall villain being seen and told. That's also because Brendan Lee Mulligan is a freaking genius. Okay, so chat just pointed out, and I really like this example, is something cool about Avatar: The Last Airbender is that you get both poles of villains. Azula is a tragic character, and Ozai is pure evil. Well, not to talk too much about Avatar: The Last Airbender, though I can. The Azula is a character that you follow. After all, they are an NPC created to follow along with Zuko. Torturing him to see what happens when he followed his dad's instructions, but if he didn't ever have a sense of moralship. And then you start seeing Azula become a tragic character. You feel bad for Azula by the time you're reaching the end of the series, because she slowly starts to lose her mind. I'm sorry if I'm spoiling this, by the way. If you haven't seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, and this stream ends, please go watch it. It's so good. It is a true masterclass in how to tell a story. And then you have Ozai, who is voiced by Mark Hamill, and is just chaos. He's evil incarnate. His motivation is purely, I'm evil, and that's why I should rule everything. But he's not as sympathetic as someone to say, as Azula, or perhaps Pai Mei. You're starting to see this range of villains, because you can have your villain just be, well, I'm evil, and I'm kind of okay with being evil, so I'm gonna be evil. It's what I'm good at. And you are starting to tell this story of, well, I believe what I did was right, and that's why I'm doing it. You could have twisted morals. Remember, the history is written by the victors. What one set of people find themselves to be the good guys, the moral righteousness. The other set could find that they are the good guys, and you can have two quote-unquote heroes clash and fight each other. And that's when you start telling some of these interesting narratives of, because villains are going to be just as dynamic as your players are going to be. Not all of your players are going to be on the same page about everything. They are going to agree and disagree, and overall kind of tell this intricate story of the players coming to conflict, and not all of them agreeing on how to do it. And I really think that when you tell the same side from the villains, picture them as PCs. if your villains were PCs, how do they think of themselves? Do they just think of, well, I'm evil, I'm gonna stay evil because I am evil? Or is it just, well, I was just one bad day away and then I lost it, and now I've walked a path that I can't ever redeem myself for, and I know what I'm doing is wrong, and I can't break from it, and I need to do anything to just continue, because this is what gets me results. This is what, I atone for my past mistakes if I commit evil action here. And so you just kind of start building and building and building, and that's when the villains are going to really start fleshed out. I think I've covered all I can about villains. There's so much you can do with villains. Villains are honestly my favorite part about the game. This is why I love GMing so much, because the villain motivation will always be more and more fleshed out the more and more your players start to interact with the villains, interact with the setting, they just kind of flesh themselves out. And I really like I mentioned earlier with World Anvil, I genuinely was using it to track NPCs and how they were interacting with the world outside of the player's scope. So another comment that I saw that I kind of want to talk about was how to implement player backstories to the world. This is a complicated measure, and this is why I'm tackling this section last, because this is probably one of the most complicated things you can do as a GM. Having a small conversation with your players is what's really going to help here. Some players are going to come in with a 32-page backstory, and you're not going to be able to read it all because, God, you either don't have the attention span or it is just way too many details to, properly inhabit your world. But let's say your player is just like, I really want to come from a kingdom and, I'm lost nobility. Well, perhaps it is not hard for you to come up with a kingdom. And because they lost they're driven by trying to reclaim it. Think very much Percival in the latest season of Critical Role. Legends of Vox Machina. It's quite literally Whitestone probably didn't really exist before Percy, but now it does because of your player. Don't do anything where you're going to compromise your setting for what your player wants to do. If your setting is, the elves all left the world because at the end of the last campaign, they all decided to up and move west, and you'll never see the elves again. Having your player roll up an elf, probably a line crossed. You're not going... It is just a bound where you have to talk to your player and go, well, we have to find some sort of compromise, because I was very clear when I said elves do not exist in the world. You cannot run with them because, according to the Lord, they all left. You're not going to find any more elves here. And so, have your players start giving you villains, essentially. Tell your players, and this is just advice I give to mine, give me 3 knives. That's all I need, is just 3 knives. These are potential plot hooks that you are that you as a player want to start seeing played out in your game, and you can start building your villain motivation around the overall narrative being told. So an example of this is I'm going to go back to Avatar Last Airbender here, but the Fire Nation is the overall setting, right? You have Zuko, who's a PC that was specifically made to function inside Fire Nation. You have Aang, who is going to be your one little special character because they decided to play the Avatar, and more power to them. But you kind of all see that the Southern Water Tribe, that is a mouthful, is probably influenced by Katara Katara's background. Like, her being a kind of uh, motherly patron, I guess it would be the case here. Just very much a overall mother like figure because her mother died. That's how you adapt the world to her. Her backstory is, well, my mom's dead and I had to take over her chores. Well, my brother Sokka takes over my father's chores as he's fighting in the war. Just tell that story, and that's all you really need to do. Because, just with that, my mother died at the hands of the Fire Nation. Well, you had another episode where you had to deal with what happens if you find the one responsible for killing your mother. And that's how you start incorporating your players' backstories into the actual game itself, is when you take those knives that they gave you and start kind of plunging them into your players' backs. Now, granted, they're not going to always be happy about this, but they're your villains and you need to tell a story. If your players don't like conflict, put them on baby mode and give them a pat on the head. So, one of just the more important things I really want to stress while I got the time, I could kind of feel my voice starting to run out, so I don't think we're going to be doing this stream for too much longer. The thing to just keep in mind is you're still a GM. End of the day, you say no. If you really think that a character detail is too extravagant, it's too out there for your setting that you're trying, or the story you're trying to tell, then you can just say no and just work with them on a way of fixing it. Your player really wants to be like connected to the elves. Well, Aragorn from Lord of the Rings is connected to the elves. Even after the elves all move west after the end of Lord of the Rings, he still has that background. He can speak Elvish. His love is an Elvish woman. Now, granted, he has a bunch of other backstory reasons to cause all of this. But so if you want your player to be connected to elves where elves don't exist, well, perhaps maybe they were raised with elves before the campaign started. Oh boy, I'm gonna just use first. Guess not. There it goes. Of course, I just had to say it out loud. And there it goes. Awesome. So, having your overall story be driven by your players is how you really tie their backstories into it. Perhaps they're approaching a town where they used to have an NPC there. And, their NPC was either a mother or father, or a certain key NPC that really relates to their backstory. Just having an NPC show up for a little bit will really help you incorporate their backstories, help them feel more intact with the world, and is going to tell this very much rich, dynamic setting. And honestly, I know I just seriously can't stop talking about World Anvil and the fact that it does such a great job of like incorporating all of this into one play. And I really like telling a very rich and dynamic story. After all, I just probably listed out 20 different settings that you could easily pick up from. And these kind of rules don't just apply to Pathfinder. You can tell kids on bikes from a very specific kind of setting where it's like, okay, we're taking place in the 80s. What does this look like? And feel free to honestly reference other settings. You can't really get your point across. Start telling people what's the closest vibe, essentially, to your original setting? Is it the Avatar: The Last Airbender, where it's going to be very close to, everybody has access to the elements, or is it closer to Lord of the Rings, where, it's very medieval fantasy, and that's kind of where you start taking it. Just seriously, I cannot stress that if you just give your players a reference point of, well, this is where they start, and this is this is the general vibe I'm going for. If I'm playing Masks: A New Generation, which I'm trying to get up and running, when I approached my players with it, I said I very much want this to be the boys mixed with X-Men. Well, that tells me I have two very dark settings combining with each other, and then I'm going to mix with it. And that gives your players a tone to go with. If you want very much a revenge-driven plot, maybe referencing John Wick, or if your players are, and I can cover this in another video, you can just kind of just reference materials. If your players are having a hard time coming up with a strategy of what kind of player do they want to be, you're just like, okay, what's a media figure you kind of want your player to vibe? If you want it like Oliver Queen from Arrow, which is a very dark take on the Green Arrow character, well, what about that player? What about that character that really likes getting you motivated to, what about them is what you want your character to reflect, essentially. And so just referencing media is going to be the ultimate helpful guide I can really stress. And if you don't watch a lot of media, then reference books, reference just any settings. We all heard a story at one point or another in our lives. And if you haven't, I suggest starting with Avatar: Last Airbender. So, to kind of wrap up this section before I start really closing out everything, is have your players start in have your villains influence your world. They are going to affect your players, as all the villains' actions should correlate to what the players are doing. And then you can just change your world depending on how that particular world is going and, where you see the plot going forward. After all, your players are going to give you more, what I call knives, probably better known as plot hooks, will probably give you more and more of those as the setting goes on. Maybe they get attached to certain NPCs that you created on the spot, and now that NPC is key to your story that you kind of didn't expect them to be. Yeah. One advice I can really always stress to new GMs is players will always find ways of messing with things. They are going to find ways of taking your notes, throwing them out the door, and you're telling this completely other narrative that you weren't expecting. So you have your villains. Make sure you just give them a level or two of motivation, whether it just be a bullet point of, well, they're evil. How much more I need to talk about that? Or maybe 4 or 5 bullet points of, well, my planet was ravished, I needed supplies, and the only way to do that was destroying half the life in the universe so I can quickly grab up their supplies, because that'll solve whatever equilibrium nonsense. But, that is what they kind of started to tell. And if that's where you want your story to go, then have your villains starting to reflect that. Don't be afraid to just let your villains do evil shit, because that's what they're gonna do. They love being evil. They need to be evil. And sometimes your villains are just somebody sympathetic who had a really bad day. Sometimes your villains are gonna just be the reverse of what happens when your players go a step too far in the wrong direction. A line that wasn't supposed to be crossed got crossed. So, if that's your villains, when looking at your players, building their backstories into the plot is what's really going to help. if you're running an AP, especially a Pathfinder AP, give them the player's guide. Give them backgrounds that specifically relate to the overall campaign you're trying to tell. If you're running an AP such as Ruby Phoenix, that comes with a player's guide that gives your players ideas or options on where they want to take their characters. Where is the story that is really going to be told throughout this AP? And then, let's say they invent a certain NPC that doesn't exist in the book. Well, instead of facing Tino's toughest in the beginning, maybe they're fighting Noculus toughest. You know, just changing NPCs. Like, quite literally just going, well, you had this NPC here, and now they're this NPC. Or if you're particularly adventurous and brave, add your own NPC into the mix. Perhaps you wanted a certain NPC to be in the story, and you just didn't see any other avenues. Add them to it. What is their motivation for being in the overall story? And so, as we kind of wrap up, just remember to just flesh out your overall plot, the story, and your players are going to really, you don't have to write a lot. You don't have to write a 50-page book. If you want to, get something as thick as a Lost Omens book and you want to like publish it to Pathfinder Infinite or Drive Through RPG, that's great. If you genuinely like doing that, then do it. If your players are very lore heavy players, write as much as they really want. If you want to focus on the intricate tax system of a certain nation, and feel free to have your players open up Excel sheets and start tracking all their imports and exports, and basically do accounting in your TTRPG game. A setting will be rich as long as your players enjoy it. You can have your lands be each set in a completely different theme, as long as you just tie it back to some sort of central theme. Your villains are going to get tied to this theme. Players are going to be tied to this theme. Your setting is going to be tied to this particular theme. Having your players and your villains all tell this theme is really what's going to have your overall experience be enriched. You're going to start seeing a better and bigger improvement to your games. Not to say your games were already bad, just meaning you're going to start telling this very different idea. And don't be afraid of your games morphing and changing. After all, your world is dynamic. We all know that Earth, like as we are here today, I hope to God we're on Earth and not the Matrix, you can see as every generation comes about, the world is slightly different than the last one. Your players are going to have the same effect. If you're telling a high stakes, the world might end and you guys are the only ones to stop it, then that's where you're going to start seeing the world start to really change. And don't be afraid to let change come with it. Perhaps major events happen in the background, and because of that major event, the world is now suddenly slightly different than where you last left it. Don't be afraid to just straight up have a meteor strike down on the Earth and let it implode a little bit and see what the consequences are there. Have 5 chromatic dragons storm a particular kingdom and continent and see what happens after that. You can just start telling this overall narrative because you're just allowing things to change. Your settings should be just as dynamic as your villains and your players are. And if you want just standard Scooby-Doo of, well, we have this bad guy this week, and I implore you to keep that feeling going as you are just going to tell this miraculous event. And I really don't think I can touch more on anything else because you guys in chat were just so helpful in If you're catching us later in the VOD, well, thank you for watching up to this point, and remember to support us on Patreon, as any proceeds will immediately go to our artists. If you didn't notice, at the bottom of this stream, we have a counter setup for if we hit $250 whenever that happens, you will get a bonus animated video that I will help write live on screen, perhaps even voice a character or two for the upcoming adventure or story. I also just want to give a great shout out to our sponsors over at World Anvil. They make genuinely amazing products, and I cannot thank them enough for reaching out and, you know, setting up this amazing partnership. I'm super looking forward to seeing where we all go in the future. And if you want, you can personally follow me at the socials as you see down below. And if you want to just talk with me further, and if you want to talk to anyone in the community, then seriously join our Discord. We have a very vibrant community. In fact, I can't stop counting. You'll understand what that reference means if you join. But for now, I think I'm going to wrap up the stream and just say thank you all for watching, hanging out with me. I love this time of week, every week, no matter where I am, because hanging out and just talking about geek stuff is what I love doing, and you guys make it such a fun time and possible. If you're still watching to this point, also hit the like button and leave a comment. The YouTube algorithm is a weird one and is constantly ever changing. So just by engaging with the stream and by hitting like, subscribe, whatever you want to do, you really help out the channel a lot. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who supports Deadly D8 and all that we do. I seriously, from the bottom of my heart, I really love doing this every week, and I hope to see you guys in the next stream. For now, see you in the next video. Bye.